Hello world, and welcome to episode 13 of What Does This Knob Do? As announced, I am going to deal with VCAs this time, but I'll also take a look at attenuators, attenuverters, because the tasks are similar and some modules appear in both sections. A few of the modules also have other areas of application. For these, I limit myself to the functions as VCA or attenuator and look at the other functions in another episode that deals specifically with these. I will introduce all 52 modules in this episode because I assume that this is very fast because VCAs often only have input, output, volume control, and maybe a CV input socket for linear or exponential modulation. In classical subtractive synthesis, you don't need any more. VCO for sound generation, VCF for sound design, VCA to influence the volume of the sound, and an envelope generator to control a temporal change of the sound and also the volume, because some sounds should start immediately and others have a settling time, and the same applies to the reverberation. In this context, one usually only thinks of the envelope generator or ADSR, but if it has nothing to control, it does nothing at all. So the VCA is very important. You could call it the heart of the system, because without it there is no sound. And yet it is often treated very negligently, so we can be very curious to see how the various developers deal with it. I have also changed my setup a little bit or added something. Up to the VCO1 of fundamental, everything remained the same. Its signal now goes into fundamentals VCF, and from there directly to the mixer and audio output on the one hand, and into a VCA or attenuator on the other, whose envelope is formed by fundamentals ADSR. In the Bock audio analyzer, the log instrument spectrum analyzer, and the JW module's full scope, I juxtapose the two signals so that we can see what the VCA does with the input signal. Tools from animated circuits is part of the welcome package and was therefore one of the freely available modules of the developer. In the meantime, however, all its modules are free of charge and can be downloaded from its website. Attenuverter is printed big on the module, but it's much more than that, but I won't discuss the other features today. All knobs in the attenuverter section are neutral in the middle position, and rotated to the right increase the amount of the respective parameter in the output signal, while rotated to the left inverts the signal. In principle, each of the four attenuators has its own input and output. So everyone can receive a different signal, but as long as there is at least one input signal, this can be tapped at all outputs. The top row adds a fixed value to the input signal. 0, 1, 3 and 5 volts can be selected, whereby these values also become negative when turned to the left. The selected value is always output in the middle position. Lines 2 and 3 are identical, and here the signal can be rectified. To do this, click on the rect field, which then inverts its color and has white writing on a blue background. If this field is not clicked, the knob works normally as an attenuator. The same applies to the fourth row. Where the signal cannot fall below 0 volt. When the 0 field is activated, all values below it are normalized to 0 volt. If the knob is turned to the left, the effect is the same, but the curve is inverted. Tools is a very interesting module, especially if the different areas are connected in series. But it drastically reduces its range of application because not a single parameter can be controlled by CV. That's too bad. VCA and quad VCA mixer from AS modules are much more classic. Both are identical in handling, whereby the quad VCA still has the additional mixer option. VCA consists of two independent areas, quad VCA of 4, which can also be output as a sum signal at the mix output if the other outputs are not occupied. The sliders attenuate the input signal. In the middle position the amplitude is halved, at the bottom 0, and at the top 100% of the input signal. So like most VCAs, we are not dealing with an amplifier but with an attenuator. Each section has an input, an output and a CV input, which is mostly used for an envelope signal, but of course other modulation signals are also possible, like LFO or velocity. The Lin-X switch is used to define the type of amplitude change. Lin means linear and therefore an even increase or decrease. X means exponential, with which the change begins gently and then increases more strongly, seen well in the scope when using an ADSR. Linear is a gentle change of the signal, exponential a sudden and jerky change. In quad VCA, this switch is marked with symbols. Red lights below the inputs also show which signals are summed in the mix output. Two simple and straightforward VCA that do what they are supposed to do. Also in the department Attenuverter, AS is represented with the module Attenuverter. Also, this module consists of two independent identical areas. In addition to input and output, there is also a CV-in socket for each of the two parameters. If both knobs are in the middle position, no input signal is output, or if an ADSR is used to modulate the atten parameter, the same signal as with the VCA with 100%. If you turn atten to the left, the signal is inverted. To the far right, it corresponds to the input signal. With modulated atten, a slight inverted modulation is noticeable on the left and a doubling of the amplitude on the right. The offset parameter adds 0 to 10 volts to the signal when it is turned to the right and negative values when it is turned to the left. Thanks to the CV inputs, Attenuverter can also be used as VCA, but only with a linear modulation. But the offset parameter is definitely an added value. As always, the AS modules leave a very positive impression on me and deserve the rating simple and good again. The Audible Instruments modules, Quad VCA and Quad VC Polarizer, look very similar but function differently. Both consist of 4 identical independent units, each with one input and one output socket, as well as a CV input socket with corresponding attenuator and a rotary knob for the parameter. Both are, like all modules from Audible Instruments, modulated after Eurorack modules from Mutable Instruments. Wales was the inspiration for the Quad VCA. The large white parameter button is responsible for the signal's amount and starts with 0 on the left and maximum on the right. But with a modulation signal in the CV input, the amplitude of the input signal is already reached in the middle position and the doubling is at the far right. Linear and exponential can be infinitely adjusted with a small black knob. On exponential, the amplitude change is much clearer, and here the value of the input signal is already reached at about 8 o'clock, with a balance ratio at about 9 o'clock. The output sockets are connected to each other. If you use only the lowest one, there is a mixed signal from all input sockets. What I definitely like about the module is the possibility of infinitely variable regulation between a linear and exponential. Good idea. Balaclava from South Pole corresponds 100% to this module, but is much more compact. The Quad VC Polarizer corresponds to blinds. The parameter knob does not pass a signal in the center position, fades it in up to 100% of the input signal when rotated to the right, and inverts it in the same ratio when rotated to the left. If this is on the right and a modulation signal is present at the CV input, the amplitude is increased up to twice as much when the corresponding attenuator is turned to the right. If you turn it to the left, you get a slight modulation and the amplitude decreases, finally reaches 0 and is inverted. If the knob is at the left stop, we have the full inverted signal with full modulation. The same applies vice versa if the parameter controller is at the far left. The output sockets are also interconnected here. The LEDs under the modulation controllers light up green when the signal is positive and red when the signal is negative or inverted. Very interesting results can also be obtained by feeding an additional audio signal into the CV input socket from a rectified waveform to a ring modulator. This module is also very interesting and offers a lot more than the normal VCA functions. Also here there is a more compact module from South Pole called Bandana. The keyframer mixer is the VCV-Rack version of frames and of course much more than a VCA. In principle, we also have 4 VCA available, all of which have an input and output socket and a corresponding controller. In this use there are no CV inputs and the signal amount can be 0 to 100% of the input signal. Each signal can be tapped at the output of the corresponding input. If the all input is used instead of the individual inputs, the signal can be picked up at all outputs and sent to different receivers in different amounts, for example. If the mix output is used instead of the individual outputs, a mix of the input signals is applied, whereby the mixing ratio of the signals can be adjusted. The most interesting thing is, of course, when you use the keyframes. Then a CV and envelope control is also possible. The principle is actually quite simple and we have already seen it similar with a phasor harmonic VCO from NIST. You take snapshots and then you play them one after the other, like in a movie. The snapshots or keyframes here are the positions of the 4 white controls 1 to 4. To create a keyframe, click on the round gray area Add, whereupon the large LED lights up green and the large frame button also lights up. Now set the 4 white knobs as desired and turn the frame button until the green LED goes out. Now you can create the next keyframe. Each frame gets its own color. You can switch between the individual keyframes by turning the frame knob or by modulating the input frame, and here the envelope comes into play. The intensity of this modulation is adjusted with the corresponding attenuator, whereby both positive and negative modulation are possible. Single keyframes can be deleted by clicking on the gray round del button. The plus 10 volt offset slider is used to output a fixed 10 volt voltage to all inputs without an input signal. A trigger pulse is output at the FR step output each time a new keyframe is reached. All current keyframes can be deleted at once in the context menu, which, as always, can be called up by right-clicking. Keyframer can also be switched to poly LFO here, but I won't discuss this until another episode. In addition, the interpolation and the response curve for each of the 4 channels can also be defined here. The interpolation is the transition between the keyframes. Here there are 6 different possibilities: step, no transition, linear, even transition, accelerating, slow at first then faster, decelerating, faster at first then slower, smooth departure arrival, slow start and end, and bouncing, jumpy transition. Response curve determines how the modulation works. Here the usual options are linear and exponential. Even this short overview has clearly shown that this module is much more than a VCA. Therefore, I can only recommend, as with all modules of audible instruments, to deal with it intensively. The effort is worth it. Autin's AMP has the usual trio jacks and a large wide knob for the signal. Left, the value is 0, in the middle equal to the input signal, and right, double the amplitude, so a real amplifier. With CV input, the behavior of this control changes, and to have a real envelope signal, you have to turn it far to the left, preferably completely. And even then, it jumps from 100% input signal to double value. And the modulation type is not adjustable, it seems to be an exponential modulation. To get a linear modulation here, you can add another module of Autin, Mera. If it is switched before, the input signal of the modulation can be reduced to 0 and the modulation is linear. For this option, the input and output of the pre-section are to be used. With a wide control, the strength of the output signal is determined, whereby already in the middle position twice the input value is reached. The further this knob is turned to the right, the greater the amplitude. If you use the post section, you have the amplitude of the input signal on the far right, and to the left this goes through the ceiling. And to the far left each signal becomes a square wave. Both modules are real amplifiers, but I would have liked Mera to have a CV-in as well. If you use them together, the versatility increases enormously. The dual attenuator from Befaco corresponds to attenuator from ES, but has no CV input. A times B plus C does not have it either, but each of the two units of this module has 3 inputs, 2 of which are adjustable. If an input signal is present at input A, this is multiplied by signal B and added to signal C. If no signal is present at one of these inputs, the value for B is 5 volt and for C is 10 volt. With the value of attenuator B, the signal of B is multiplied, whereby the range goes from -2 to +2. The same applies to C, where the range is -1 to +1. Output 2 is also the sum of both units. The controller paths are always exponential. If you insert an audio signal into input A and a modulation signal into input B, you can use control B level to determine the strength of this modulation. This can be positive as well as negative again, and with the control and the signal at C, an offset can be defined to cut off high or low frequencies again. Due to its unique functionality, this module has a lot of potential which goes far beyond the use as a VCA. But here too, the combination of both modules is a real added value. The modules of Bock Audio look different for you, but I had to adapt their design a bit to work with them well. And I also made the colors to match a Bock. Bock Audio currently has 44 modules in VCV-Rack and is therefore one of the most diligent developers. Some of these modules are small in size but large in performance. This also includes VCAMP, which has the usual sockets and can add up to 12 dB to the input signal, i.e. 4 times the input value reached at 0 dB on the scale. I also like the slider very much, whose LED goes from green and yellow to red at maximum amplification. The modulation signal at the CV-in is processed exponentially. Here I would have wished for another selector switch. His colleague VCA, who is a standard VCA through and through, has this, with the 3 well-known sockets and a control to attenuate the signal, because here once again the maximum is at 100% of the input signal and is reached at the right stop. And as already mentioned, you also have the choice between linear and exponential. Offset belongs back to the attenuator area, where the volume of the input signal is adjusted with a scale parameter. The amplitude is cut off at ± 12 dB, as usual in VCV-Rack. If this is not desired, it is possible to switch off the soft clipping via the context menu. This makes the signal very loud again. The signal is inverted to the left of the middle position. This parameter has a CV input and corresponds to a linear modulation for modulation with an envelope. The offset control can also be controlled via CV and is the usual offset parameter, whereby an offset without frequency suppression is also possible here by switching off the clipping. Shaper and Shaper Plus are both a combination of VCA and envelope generator. Shaper Plus also has a CV input for each controller and a gate output for each section of the envelope. Otherwise, the 2 modules are identical and emulate the envelope unit of the EMS V3. The input signal at input in is amplified with a parameter signal. At position 0 there is no output signal. At 1 we already have 100%, at 2 200%, and so on. As usual with an envelope generator, a trigger is required to start the envelope. There is an input and a button for this. If this is clicked, the envelope is triggered once when the cycle switch is set to stop, and always repeated when it is set to loop. The speed between decaying and re-triggering the envelope can be increased tenfold with a speed switch, i.e. it takes 10 times as long until the envelope is triggered again. The parameter of the envelope curve differs somewhat from the usual envelope generators, and all have a control range of 0 to 10 seconds. Attack is the usual settling time. On defines how long the tone is held until the decay phase, and off defines how long it takes for the tone to completely vanish. The envelope can be tapped at output ENV and the inverted envelope at INV. The amount of the envelope signal is determined with the ENV knob. At the end of the envelope, a trigger pulse is output at output end. In my opinion, Shaper Plus is the more useful module because the parameters of the envelope can be controlled by CV. The gate outputs also make sense. Instead of a speed switch with 2 options, I would have liked to have a stepless knob, but still a great and versatile module. The VOG audio modules are easy to use and very practice oriented. It is fun to work with them, and they do what they should do and more. The DBIS modules once again look quite complex and hardly have a description on the GitHub page. VCA4 is only called an in-out matrix mixer, which is true, but doesn't really help. Yes, it has 4 inputs and 4 outputs each, and to get one signal from input A in output 1, the black button A1 must be turned up, where 0 is on the far left, 100% in the middle and 200% on the far right, and the field A1 must be yellow. That much is clear, and therefore the module works as a VCA. But now it's interesting. I insert an envelope signal into input A1, then this modulates my input signal from A, and I can tap the modulated signal at 1, because output 1 is assigned to A1 to D1. But if I insert another modulation signal, here an LFO, into input B1, nothing happens. First, a signal must also be present at input B. Then I can set a sum signal at output 1 from A plus B, whose ratio is defined with the parameters A1 and B1, and which is modulated with the corresponding modulation signal at A1 or B1. And by deactivating the corresponding yellow button, the respective signal is also deactivated. It's really easy once you get a hang of it. Input and output result in a letter-number combination, and both input, rotary knob and yellow button must be activated with the same combination. Almost correct. The inputs with the combination do not necessarily have to be proven. If they are not, the same signal can be tapped at all outputs. This means that the active, summed and modulated input signals are output at the outputs. And of course, this doesn't only work with audio signals in the input. Maybe you just take modulation signals and send out the output as such, or you make a mixture of control voltages, or also a wild mixture of all possible signals. I think this module is a monster in terms of its possibilities, and we will certainly see it elsewhere and explore it further. The VCA 530 is of course modeled on the Roland VCA 530 and has all its parameters except the switch between linear and exponential. In principle, it consists of two identical VCAs, which in turn each have 3 identical channels. So you can connect 6 sources and adjust the volume of each one from 0 to about 3 times the input signal. Each VCA also has 3 mod-in inputs, which can also be controlled individually. The large round gain control adjusts the input volume of a VCA, and the LEDs indicate overloads. As always, you should avoid red. A sum signal of all inputs and mod inputs is available at the sum outputs. What I definitely miss here, but the original doesn't have that either, are single outputs. But clearly, this module sets other priorities. It sets standards regarding modulation possibilities in any case. The VCAs from DBIS are both quite demanding in handling, but also offer a lot for it. I can only recommend trying them for yourself. Since the VCA is something very fundamental of course also offers a lot here. The VCA1 is a simple VCA with the usual 3 sockets and a switch between linear and exponential. Once again, it is merely a signal attenuator that goes from 0 to 100%. The volume is adjusted by clicking on the view display and mouse movement. Very nice, you can see the difference between the 2 types of modulation when using an external modulation signal. The VCA2 consists of 2 identical units. In contrast to the VCA1, the volume here is set classically via a rotary knob, and exponentially and linear each have their own CV input socket and can also be used simultaneously. This enables interesting modulation effects. The module, simply called mixer, contains 4 identical VCAs. The modulation type is fixed linear. In addition, this module offers a mix output, through which the sum of the individual VCAs can be output, but also when the level control is fully turned up, a doubling of the amplitude is possible. This can also be controlled by CV, and an envelope signal introduced here seems to be processed exponentially. 8-vert is a classic attenuverter. In the middle position, the output value is 0. Rotated to the right, the input signal is output up to 100%, and rotated to the left, it is inverted. So we have no signal amplification here again. However, a special feature of this module is that an input signal is output at all outputs below it, if no further input sockets are occupied below it. It is therefore possible to insert a signal at the top input and output it at the 8 outputs with a different intensity and polarity. I really like this module, but I would like CV input jacks for the controls. As always, the fundamentals are solid and reliable modules that you can't go wrong with and are easy to use, especially for beginners. And as always, where fundamentals are, not far away is Gratrix and provides the standard modules with additional inputs and outputs. This is also the case with a VCA F1. In principle, it is a VCA from a VCA2 of fundamental. That is, it has separate inputs for linear and exponential. And because it is a Gratrix module, it has 7 of them each, just like the input. And it has 6 outputs, whereby only the corresponding input can be tapped at each output. However, the middle 7th input is output at all outputs. The Gratrix module also has 2 mix outputs, where on the one hand the sum of all inputs is output, and on the other hand the signal of the middle input is amplified to approximately 3 times, whereby the value 0 is again completely left. The modulation inputs also only affect the assigned input, except for the middle input, which again affects all of them. These additional features make the Gratrix VCA F1 more than just a copy and more versatile than its predecessor. After the excellent videos by Omri Cohn, I thought about introducing black holes by geodesics to the world. Isn't that like carrying oaths to Athens? Maybe, but this episode wouldn't be complete without this great module. Alright, let's go. Gravitational atomic set is under the name, which is a nice term but says nothing about the module. If you look at the description, you see that the module consists of 8 VCAs or 2 4-channel mixers. Regardless of the great design, the module is actually a simple VCA. We have an input and an output in the CVN with a corresponding attenuator, which can invert the signal as it should. And with spaghettification, there is also a switch between linear and exponential. And there are 4 of these units in each of the 2 areas. Nothing special so far. The output jack in the middle of a black hole outputs the sum signal of all grouped VCAs. That sounds interesting. A control voltage can be tapped at the corresponding outputs without an input signal. With the gravity switch, you can configure the modulation input. ±10 volt for envelope and gate, ±5 volt for LFO and VCO. With the switch wormhole, you activate the wormhole effect, which sends the sum signal of the first black hole to the second black hole and splits it among the inputs, so that a further signal modulation can take place here, and this again can be separated and output in sum. It all sounds very complicated, but on closer inspection it is simple and ingenious. And of course, as with any VCA, you can feed in multiple audio signals and or multiple modulation signals. Also here, I can only recommend to experiment yourself, because probably there is much more to do than the developers had imagined. The Amplitude VC mixer from Hora is one of the developer's free modules, which can be found in the plugin manager under VCO, VCF, VCA free, but can only be downloaded from the developer's website. The first thing that catches the eye here is the unusual design, which may seem a bit confusing at first. Here we have again 2 identical VCA in one module. Input and output are as before. The envelope signal is put into the strength input and is amplified with a corresponding attenuator to the right up to 100% and inverted to the left. Accent defines the type of modulation. This is similar to linear and exponential, but will never be as smooth as linear. To the right, the accent is longest, to the left, short and sharp. This can also be controlled by CV. In the LED quadrant, you can see the phase and amplitude of the input signal vertically and the phase and amplitude of the parameter strength horizontally. Finally, both VCAs are output together in the mix output. For this, an external signal can be mixed, for which there is a separate input plus attenuator. This module is most interesting for me if you tap the sum of both VCAs and the external signal at the mix output, and both VCAs have different modulation sources. Suddenly he does things a normal VCA doesn't. The pan VCA from MSM modules also consists of two independent identical units, at least in the switch position norm. Here we have an attenuator for each side, which starts at 0 on the left and does not reach twice the amplitude on the right. Each side has a separate input, output and CV input, and a switch for linear or exponential modulation. There is also an output for the sum signal and the inverted sum signal. The CV input P and the parameter button pan only work in pan mode, which must be activated via the corresponding switch. These change the proportion of the two VCAs in the sum signal, whereby one of the signals never occurs alone in the sum signal. Also here is most interesting to work with the sum of one side linear and the other side exponentially modulated, and of course the panorama. The simple slider also has two modes. In VCA mode you can adjust the volume between 0 and 100% of the input signal or via CV. Control by envelope is not possible, but by LFO. In crossfader mode, you can fade between two input signals. Here too, control with LFO is possible, but not via envelope. Even though you can use this module as a VCA, I see the main task as a crossfader, because you can fade all kinds of things into each other and control it via LFO. The MSM modules are once again unusual but useful. Maybe not for daily use, but every now and then they make sense. The AS-AF8 autofader from MSC Hack is listed under Attenuator, and its task is to fade a signal in and out. This can be a stereo signal as well as a mono signal, and in principle it does not have to be an audio signal. The module has 8 identical independent units. Each unit has 2 inputs and 2 assigned outputs. The gate input expects an on-off signal, i.e. either a bipolar gate signal or a trigger pulse. An envelope only works when the original unipolar signal has been converted. If the input receives a voltage, 1 volt is sufficient here, the adjacent square lights up green and the fade-in is started. The signal is then held as long as the voltage is present. If the light goes out, the voltage is gone and the fade-out is started. The speed in and out controls are used to set the duration of the two events. For this I would have wished for a CV input. By the way, when these controllers are actuated, the currently set time of the parameter is displayed in seconds. A small but useful detail. The AS-AF8 is definitely a tool to automate a patch, and it does that very well. Therefore, it is incomprehensible to me that the duration of the fading in and out cannot be controlled by CV. But maybe there will be an update that can do that. The two modules NE1 and NE2 of Nocturnal Encoder are listed under VCA and attenuator respectively, but have very special areas of application. NE2 turns an audio signal into a CV signal, and NE1 turns a CV signal into an audio signal. Both are intended for communication with the Eurorack world outside of VCV-Rack. But what happens to an audio signal that has been converted to CV and then back to audio? Is then the output signal identical with the input signal? Far from it, and that makes it interesting for other applications as well. Obviously, we're on the extreme margins of VCA and attenuator here. And since we're usually talking about audio signals, I'll just take a closer look at that here. The audio signal is inserted into one of the inputs of NE2 and output at the corresponding output. Carrier defines the strength of the output signal from 0 to 100%. The output signal is introduced into NE1, which consists of two identical independent units. In general, it can be said that the CV signal is analyzed and a new audio signal is generated from its envelope. So basically an envelope follower. And this is exactly what all parameters in NE1 are designed for. Attack and release control the general speed of the envelope follower, with the values on the left being the lowest. The parameter atten defines the strength of the signal. In the middle position, the value is 0, the rightmost full signal, the leftmost full inverted signal. With offset, the signal is shifted by ±10 volt, thus the unipolar signal can become bipolar. With scale, the signal can be amplified. On the far left 100%, no amplification, is on the far right 300%. If you insert an audio signal into NE1, it can be processed with the parameters and scale functions as an audio amplifier. If this signal is now reintroduced into the NE2, it produces a CV signal matching the envelope, thus reversing the principle of the envelope follower. If a CV signal is inserted into NE2, carrier again defines the output strength of the signal, and with the parameters of NE1 this can also be further shaped. However, the offset must then be negative. Scale does not define the volume of the signal, but the strength of the modulation. Once again, you can see very clearly that it can be very interesting to use modules differently than the developer intended. Have fun experimenting. Baseliner and BSL1R from Noob Hour are listed under attenuator, but fit better under switch, so I will introduce them there first. And of course, VCA and attenuator are included in the 77 NIST modules. 8 attack decay is of course first and foremost an envelope generator, and therefore we will see it again in the corresponding episode. But it is also a full VCA, or better said 8 VCA and 1 special. Each VCA has an input, an output and an output for the envelope. In addition, 1 input for a trigger pulse and 1 output each for a trigger generated at the end of the rise of the envelope and at the end of the cycle. Without a gate signal, nothing happens at first, as is usual with envelope generators. Here you can bypass this by activating the looped button. If you click on Tap Trigger, the trigger pulse is always repeated. If looped is deactivated, you can generate a unique trigger, a one-shot. But of course you can also send a trigger pulse to the trig-in input. The other parameters are attack and decay of the envelope, and an attenuverter for linear and exponential modulation that is neutral in the middle and linear to the left and exponential to the right. Scale determines the signal gain, which is double on the far right and inverts the envelope on the far left. And then there's the global section, which caused me some headaches, because the 3 lower jacks don't really belong to it. Here we have one knob each for attack and decay, which affect all 8 units and can be controlled via CV. The modulation can also be set globally here, but can still be fine-tuned in each unit. The same applies to the scale parameter, which allows more nuanced but also stronger settings. And the trigger pulse here also applies to all units and supplements the pulses in the units. And then the 3 other jacks. The VCA in jack does not add its signal to the individual VCAs, but this signal can be influenced by all parameters of all units selected with a Unity Mix button. This makes very complex envelopes possible, of course, and I will discuss this in another episode. The VCA output is therefore not the sum of the individual VCA signals, but for the signal processed with all envelopes. However, these envelopes are added and output as a sum at the Unity Mix output and can thus be used to modulate other modules. Especially these 3 jacks lift 8 attack decay far beyond a normal VCA or envelope generator, but you first have to understand how they work. SOU means source of uncertainty and is a term Buchla brought into the world of synthesizers. NIST has several modules that have this term in their name and provide various random functions. SOU utils consists of 3 different areas, each of which consists of 2 identical independent units. Scalar offsetter amplifies the signal with a parameter scale, whereby the same value with inverted signal is reached on the right 200% and on the left. We have no signal in the middle position. Offset adds plus minus 10 volts, and thus a unipolar signal can be made bipolar again and vice versa. A standard VCA volume effect is possible with an envelope in the CV input scale. The offset parameter can also be controlled via CV. The other 2 sections, octave folder and analog shift registers, are described in another episode. One module that I always use when I need a signal amplifier is surveillance. The range switch is used to define the general behavior of the module or the global CV in parameter. If 0 to 10 volts is selected, the large black button functions as an attenuator from 0 volts left to 10 volts right. In the mode -5 to +5 volts, we have in the middle position 0 volt and right +5 volt and left -5 and the inverted signal. Each of the 10 control knobs is also designed as an attenuator and multiplies the signal by 5 or 10 depending on how the range is set. To the left, the signal is also inverted again, which is especially interesting for the 0 to 10 volt mode because this also achieves negative values. And of course, different voltage can be set at each control output. And in the global CV-in, of course, any kind of signal can be introduced. Now it would be great if you could control all parameters via CV as well, e.g. to have a separate envelope for each parameter or velocity or LFO. The Auto X fader can also act as a modulated VCA in fader mode. In this case, the parameters fade in time and fade out time take over the function of the envelope, and this can also be controlled via CV. A trigger signal in the input fade in trig triggers this, or for a one-shot also a click on the field fade in tab. The outputs of the out column output the trigger signal unchanged. The rows fade in and fade out also each have an output EO fade at which a trigger signal is generated when the end of the respective fade is reached, i.e. either fully faded in or again at 0. For a loop, it is necessary to connect the fade-in EO fade with the fade-out trig-in. Thus the end of the fade-in triggers the beginning of the fade-out. The fade EXP button switches to exponential modulation. This can also be triggered by a trigger. The X-fading button switches the module to crossfade mode, which allows fading between the inputs and outputs of the left side and those of the right side. So you can generate up to 8 fades or up to 4 crossfades with this module. Const add mult adds, multiplies or divides the input signal by a fixed or variable voltage. The input signal is introduced in A-in, a modulation signal or another CV source can be introduced in input B-in and output unchanged at B-out. Without a signal in B-in, the voltage can also be adjusted by clicking in the number display and moving the mouse up and down. The further you click in the field on the left, the finer the setting can be. If both inputs are not used, the voltage set here is output at outputs B and A plus B. The outputs are unique, whereby in the case of A divided B, a random value is output if B is 0 and 0 if A is 0. The modules of NIST have one thing in common: they cannot be defined to one task. Anyway, I keep coming up with new things when I work with them. So also here is to try out and experiment, absolutely announced. The panner module from PG Instruments can also be used as attenuators. Of course, the panorama plays an important role here. 100% of the input signal is therefore only reached on the far left and far right. If the panorama is balanced, the amplitude is lower. With the level control of the quad panner and the oct panner, this is adjusted. In principle, these two modules have the same structure. They consist of 4 or 8 identical units, which have an input, a panorama control and a level control. All units are output together at one stereo output. The panner has a slightly different structure. It lacks the level control, but it has a CV input for panning. Both an LFO and an envelope can be used to generate interesting amplitude changes. With the envelope, the panning slider also affects the separation between the successive envelopes. On the far left is a strong separation, on the far right it is rather fluid. It's also exciting to insert a CV signal into the input, but I'm not going to go into that until panners are reviewed in another episode. I must admit, with some modules I let myself be deterred by their appearance. This is also the case with the modules of PVC, whereby I am not concerned here with questions of taste, but simply and touchingly with things such as contrast and clarity. That's why I took the liberty to adapt these modules to my viewing habits. Unfortunately, the GitHub side of the developer tells very little about the modules, so I have to make it up again. Kozuov has a lot to offer that goes far beyond the scope of this episode. That's why I quickly fade out the lower part of the module. The easiest way to handle this module is to use it as a simply attenuator. To do this, a signal is introduced at a pause input and its volume adjusted with level. As usual, left 0 and right 100% of the input signal. With offset, this can be shifted by plus/minus 10 volt. Both the upper and lower limits are cut off, thus naturally eliminating high or low frequencies. In output sum, the signal can be tapped. In output moose, the inverted signal. If you use the input neck, everything is reversed. If the offset control is in the right half, i.e. positive, there is always a signal at the sum output that is trimmed in height, the direction of which is determined by selecting the pos or neg input. At the same time, a signal cut in the low frequencies is present at the moose output, and this can also be inverted. If the offset control is in the left, i.e. negative range, moose outputs the treble reduced signal and sum the bass reduced signal. The further out the offset control is, the more frequencies are cut off, and the amplitude is also influenced by the level control. If the same input signal is applied to both inputs, the level controls must not be set to the same level. Otherwise, the signals cancel each other out. Of course, different signals can also be applied to both inputs. In such a case, the sum signal or the inverted sum signal is output at the outputs. Of course, this can be influenced by level and offset. Sounds complicated? It is, and that was only half the module. The rest comes in the episode about gates. VAMPs, on the other hand, is really boring. It has two inputs, whereby both a stereo signal and two completely different signals can be introduced here. In addition, with a mono signal, you get an output at both outputs of the left input. Otherwise, only one input signal at the corresponding output. The modulation can be linear and exponential, and both have separate input jacks, allowing simultaneous modulation with both options. The output volume is set between 0 and 100% with the level control. And that's it. A simple stereo VCA. The modules of PVC definitely deserve more attention, and I will certainly look at them more closely now that they are more in line with my viewing habits. Mix from Quelk was also a real challenge. It consists of two quasi-identical units, which are however for good reason once red and once blue deposited. They all have the property that both inputs, i.e. either L&R or M&S, need an input signal. If the L&R inputs are used with the same signal, this can only be tapped via the mid output. The parameter amp is used to determine the maximum amplitude of the signal between 0 left and 200% right, but the attenuator mid must also be turned up for this, whose control range also goes from 0 left to 100% of the value of AMP on the right side. In the blue module, the inputs are M&S and the output L. The parameters are identical, but here amp only goes up to 100%. If different signals are introduced into L&R or M&S, they add up in the mid or L output and subtract in the side or R output. The side or R parameter determines the strength of the subtraction. Also, here the values go from 0 left to 100% right, whereby always the right signal is subtracted from the left one. One exchanges these, one receives thereby another result. But of course the addition remains the same. If one of the input signals is a modulation signal, the amplitude of the signal is formed as described above, and the modulation signal causes an offset. For mid and L, this is positive, for side and R, negative. However, this does not influence the amplitude. If the input signals are interchanged, a positive inverted offset of the signal can be tapped at the outputs side and R. Of course, all this also works if none of the input signals is an audio signal. The parameters mid and side and L and R each have a CV input. Here a modulation signal can be introduced to change the amplitude, e.g. an envelope signal. The strength of the modulation is adjusted via the corresponding knob, and that was the easiest handling of the module. But my first thought was, Why are the exits of the red one in the blue area and vice versa? Turning the knobs very quickly showed that they were not connected to each other. Maybe they're supposed to be connected first. The first attempt to use either inputs L or R as input for an external signal was not really productive. The result at input M was exciting though. My input signal is connected to this input, side is connected to S, L to L and R to R. At output mid, the usual signal is present, but at side, an inverted version, the peaks of which can be rounded with Ctrl L, i.e. a wave shaping. If I pick up the signal at output L, I also receive my original signal, but I can also smooth this out by turning Ctrl L to the left or deform it further together with Ctrl R. I get an inverted version if the input signal is inserted in S and mid is connected to M. And I think there's a lot more to discover. So again, a VCA or attenuator that blows all boundaries. Besides the two modules Balaclava and Bandana already mentioned at the beginning, there is also the module AUX in the VCA area of South Pole. Of course, this module is primarily intended for blending in effect modules, but can also be used as a VCA. The module has two AUX ways, whereby the returns of one are connected to the sends of the other, hence the name effect loop. If only one signal is used at input red L, the same signal can be picked up at both sends. Its intensity is adjusted with the feedback knob. In the middle position we have no signal, right and left is identical. If you use only one signal at the input red R, you have no signal in the middle position again, but turn to the left, the signal comes only from the left send out, and turn to the right from the right. If different signals are present at both inputs, it is possible to fade between them, whereby again no signal is output in the middle. All other controllers have no function here, but the module also has two more inputs and outputs, here simply called L and R. A signal at input L is output at both outputs. If two signals are present, each is output at the assigned output. The mute button mutes the outputs. In this mode, it is possible to insert a modulation signal into one of the red inputs. A modulation signal in the left red input causes an offset in both signals. A modulation signal in the right red input causes only an offset in the right signal. If different modulation signals are used in both inputs, the left one affects both signals and the right one only the right one. In this mode, the amount of the offset is set via the slider under red. All other controls have no function. The mute button mutes the input signal and bypass switches the modulation. Of course, different signals can also be picked up at all send outputs in this module. The control under send determines the amplitude and the feedback control underneath determines the intensity of the offset. In the middle position the offset is 0. And turn to the right it is positive and turn to the left it is negative. If you use the other AUX channel, it's the other feedback control. AUX is also a very complex module when used as a VCA. We will take a closer look at its qualities as an effect grinding path in the effect section. Force is called attenuator and it can also be used differently. Easiest as a 6 times attenuverter since it consists of 6 identical independent units. Each has an input and output and an attenuator which does not let through any signal in the middle. To the right up to 100% and to the left the inverted signal. So first of all, nothing intoxicating. If no input signal is present, plus minus 1 volt can be tapped at the output, i.e. in principle an offset. and the blue arrows already indicated if you leave outputs free, the signal of all above empty outputs can be tapped at the next output. This makes it possible to insert a different signal into all inputs and to pick up a sum signal at the lowest output, whereby the mixing ratio of the signals can be adjusted. It is also possible to form smaller sums, e.g. by occupying the third and sixth output, so that the signals of 1 and 2 can be picked up at the third output and 4 and 5 at the sixth output. I use this module, e.g. to generate very complex waves from fundamental waveforms. By the way, a CV signal introduced into the input causes an offset, the intensity of which can be adjusted with a knob. With a range switch, the output signal can be increased tenfold, which can sometimes be very interesting for a CV signal. South Pole once again shows how you can achieve great things with small modules. The Triggerfish VCA is more or less standard again. It has one input and one output and one CV in, each for linear and exponential. This means that both modulation types can be used simultaneously again. Since everyone also has their own attenuator, their ratio can also be adjusted as desired. Left, as always, is 0 and right 100%. Gain controls the volume of the input signal, and output controls the output signal and adds saturation to it. The curve parameter acts on the exponential modulation and makes the transition smoother when it is left and more defined when it is right. The bleed parameter works very subtly and adds some of the CV in signal to the output signal. Here again there is no effect at the far left, and it becomes bigger the further the knob is turned to the right. An interesting VCA, especially due to the possibility to mix the modulation. Amongst my most used modules are Slap and Spank by Volt. Both are envelope generators with built-in VCA, the latter especially for percussive sounds like drums. The handling is very simple. The VCA has one input and one output, and to trigger the envelope a gate signal is needed, and this envelope can be tapped at the output out to modulate further modules. The soft-hard switch determines whether the gate is to be closed quickly or slowly. Soft is slow, which means that the signal is not cut off immediately. In the envelope area we find the usual 4 parameters in Slap: attack, decay, sustain and release, and all 4 can be controlled via CV and have one attenuator each, which allows no modulation in the middle position, and a positive modulation when turned to the right, and a negative modulation when turned to the left. Spank has only the 3 parameters attack, hold and decay, which are more useful for percussive envelopes. However, these can also be modulated accordingly. The switch for the gate function has another option here: loop. This allows you to specify that the gate does not have to be re-triggered each time, but repeats itself, making rebounds and similar effects possible. Knobs consists of 2 identical independent units. Each unit has a large knob whose function is determined by the switch next to it. In uni mode, it outputs 0 volts on the far left and 10 volts on the far right. In bi mode, it outputs -5 volts on the far left and +5 volts on the far right. And in mix mode, it outputs 0 volts on the far left and 100% of the signals of the corresponding small buttons on the far right. These 4 are all equal attenuators, so in the middle 0 and left negative and right positive. This means that the signal is inverted on the left. If the big button is not set to mix, it causes an offset of the signals at the 4 inputs. Up to 4 different signals can be mixed per unit, and the individual signals can also be inverted. Flux is also a very versatile module, and we will therefore meet it again elsewhere. Basically, it consists of 4 independent identical units. To use it as an attenuator, the mode switch must be set to off. The other 2 functions do not interest us today. The range parameter ranges from 0 to 200% on the far left, and with offset a value of ±5 volt can be added to this signal. The switch follower defines whether the rate parameter should be linear or exponential. In the third mode, nth, the rate parameter follows the input signal as closely as possible. In and out are the usual sockets, and CLK is for an external clock signal, which is not relevant today either. Much more important is the well-known volt modulation display. By clicking on one of the 6 letters and moving the desired button, it is selected and can be controlled via CV. And the modulation strength and its phase, i.e. positive or negative, can be adjusted with a corresponding attenuator. So, if I want to control the amplitude with an envelope, I connect the output of the ADSR to one of the CV input sockets and select the range parameter. And I already have a volume envelope. Or I let the envelope modulate the rate parameter and get a kind of filter sweep or morph effect. And of course it can be combined with each other, and we have 4 units and of course the other modes. Also with these modules, Volt shows once again impressively what is possible in VCV-Rack, and that versatility does not have to be complicated. The conclusion of today's episode is made by the X-Source attenuator module, and actually it's not anymore. An input, an output, and a button that goes from left 0 to right 100%, and that in 6 units. Pretty simple, and sometimes that's all you want. And this brings us to the end of episode 13, and I've introduced all the modules listed under VCA or attenuator. For me, this episode was a real surprise, because I hadn't expected such a great variety on this topic. But that also showed me that there is still a lot of unused potential slumbering here. I hope you have also become curious and just try something different. Next week I'm looking at envelope generators. As always, you will find links to the most important websites and also to the developers of the modules presented this time. And not to forget, many thanks to Andrew Belt and all the module developers without whom all this would not be possible. That's it from me, have a good time and take care. Servus.